Welcome. This is the Anatomy of Morality, episode 1. And the question I'll try to answer today is, how can we determine whether something is morally right or wrong? So just try to remember how many times you've heard someone say stuff like, this is evil, you're a bad person, this is immoral, this is wrong, this is bad, and just mixing all those terms together into one big salad. But when you ask them a simple question like what exactly makes something good or bad, you very quickly realize they have absolutely no clue, and that their answers tend to be annoyingly subjective and intuitive and emotional. And this is perhaps one of the most important questions in any society that pretends to be advanced or enlightened, because if we can no longer distinguish good from bad or right from wrong, and establish a clear, consistent moral framework that doesn't depend on one subjective mood or perspective at any specific point in time, then how can we possibly create a free and stable society? We use the language of morality almost every day, and very few people understand the difference between something being bad, something being wrong, something being immoral, and something being truly evil. And the problem starts with those 3 or even 4 words that are often confused. It starts from terminological inaccuracies. When you start conflating those terms and making a salad, these concepts are often mixed together or used interchangeably, but in practice, they are fundamentally and completely different things. Something can be bad without necessarily being immoral, and something can be wrong without necessarily being what we traditionally call evil. And it's essential to understand these differences, because without those clear definitions, our moral judgment becomes nothing more than personal feelings and personal interpretations. So the social rules and the logic we use to judge people's actions and often sentence them as well must remain stable and consistent as a rule of thumb. So let's start with the definition of bad. Okay, good and bad are always relative. They depend on circumstances, on perspective, and on time. So just to give you an example, a difficult workout can feel bad in the sense that it is difficult and very often unpleasant to the body at a specific moment, but it can also create strength and improve your health over time, which tends to be more associated with the word good. So the question here is, when exactly do you assess the outcome? Is it during the workout? Is it a minute before? Is it a minute later? Is it a month later? So that's completely time relative. Another really good example is breaking a leg or any form of injury that disables you from a functionality perspective. Any form of injury of this kind is objectively painful and unfortunate, but if that injury prevents someone from being sent into an active war zone where they would have died otherwise, then the same event may later be perceived differently. And one may consider themselves even lucky for that so-called unfortunate event. So bad describes the subjective experience of an outcome. It can never be objective. Humans cannot comprehend what objective good and objective bad are in the cosmos, in the universe, or if they even exist in the first place. The notion of good and bad always relies on personal beliefs. It does not automatically describe morality, though in many cases both tend to be closely related or interconnected, but that's never a guarantee. A parent, for example, may prevent their child from making a mistake, a bad life decision, eating the wrong stuff, going to the wrong places, which an impulsive child or even a teenager may perceive as bad or evil, but in fact is meant to protect them from the consequences of their own immature thinking and actions. Now, immorality is different. Immorality is not just something we dislike or feel, or something that is unpleasant to us. Immorality really concerns the action itself that violates fundamental human rights and causes unjustified harm. So if morality is reduced to personal preferences like feelings, emotions, thoughts, beliefs, opinions, and so on and so on, um, then it would completely lose its purpose, because a moral system that changes entirely according to culture, to the time period, or to even opinions, cannot distinguish justice from injustice. It can only describe what a society currently accepts. It can reflect what that society feels or what it's used to. But some principles must remain stable. All sane people, and I mean people with basic common sense, can agree that um, actions like deliberately harming an innocent person, or violating their natural human rights, or treating another being as merely an object for your own benefit, cannot become moral simply because a society approves of it. And just for the records, I use the terms moral and immoral and right and wrong interchangeably. The terms right and wrong are always linked to morality. They mean exactly the same thing as moral and immoral. Words like righteous and wrongdoing derive from these two terms. So you can totally use the same pairs of words interchangeably. Now, evil is a much narrower concept, because it's not merely causing harm or inflicting pain. Sometimes harm is necessary or even unavoidable in some cases. Evil is more connected to intention. So the deliberate desire to cause bad things like suffering, humiliation, destruction, and so on. It can appear individually as malice or sadism, like taking pleasure in another person's suffering, and it can also appear collectively through ideologies or even systems of belief, religions that justify cruelty and deny the value of human life, um, or any other life, really. So, in short, you could say that an action becomes evil when harmful intent is the driving force behind it. And you can use this table if you feel the need to memorize this. I personally think it's pretty self-explanatory and easy to remember, but that's up to you. Then the next question arising is, how do we put a moral dilemma to the test? How do we determine whether an action is truly immoral? Now, at the very core of any moral debate, argument, or dilemma, the action needs to meet 5 to 6 conditions, depending on the case. You have to ask at least 5 to 6 questions to determine whether those criteria are met or not. And the first one, the first criterion, is called victimhood. So the first one is asking whether there is a victim who suffered unjustified harm against their will. So there are 3 elements here. One is about pain or harm or damage. It can come in different forms, such as financial damage, physical harm, emotional harm. Then one is about volition, yeah, or consent. And the third one is about justification. So in a nutshell, victimhood in its most simplified form, I would say, is any unjustified harm without consent. And that's also the reason why you can technically use this term both in a situation when someone else attacks or offends you, or if something just happens to you. So you can claim to be a victim of harassment or violence as much as you can claim to be a victim of cancer or any other disease. And this criterion is used mainly for triage. I will explain it in the next slides. So the second criterion is called damage. Yeah. The second one is whether a fundamental right has been violated or real damage been inflicted. And I know it sounds very similar to victimhood, but the first condition, victimhood, is mainly used as a first step in the triage process, because technically, if there is no victim, there is no real crime, and therefore there is no moral violation. So this second condition delves a little deeper into what constitutes damage or harm, and all the technicalities of which fundamental rights have been violated or deprived. The next one is intent and awareness. So the third one is whether the harm was caused consciously, knowingly, deliberately, and or with complete disregard for the consequences. What it means, in other words, is that if I was conscious of myself and the act itself, and I still deliberately chose to harm another being while being completely apathetic and disregarding the very outcome of my actions, then we can say the condition is fully met, and thus I better have a damn good justification. The fourth one is alternative. So this one basically asks whether there was an alternative way to achieve the same goal with less harm. So it relates directly to the previous condition, number 3, meaning if you had acted differently, could you have minimized or prevented this unjustified harm? Very simple. This one only asks whether there was another way. Okay, did you have another option? Or were there any circumstances or external forces leaving you no choice but to do what you chose to do? Number 5 is lack of justification. So the fifth one is confirming whether there was a genuine justification for the action. So here we're really delving into whether the action was justified, who made the first move, was it self-defense, was anyone being coerced into harming another, did the victim deserve it, and why? So here we're dealing with very technical justice, and we look for claims that could potentially rationally justify certain behaviors or events, without going too deeply, of course, like claiming that he started, or it was self-defense, or he asked me to punch him, to claim there was consent, yeah, or I had no alternative. No alternative can often be considered justification. So criterion number 4 could also be used to feed criterion number 5. And another thing I wanted to highlight with regards to justification is that initiated harm, and that brings me to the very definition of violence. So initiated harm can never be justified, and I want you to keep this in mind. This kind of behavior is called violence or harassment or duress in some cases by their very definition. So violence is self-initiated harm or aggression, because aggression being used for self-defense, let's say, does not constitute violence, not morally and not legally. So acts of violence can never have any form of justification. Only reactions to separate actions or events can be justified against those actions or events. Another form of justification could be the lack of intent and awareness. So criterion number 3 could also play a role in criterion number 5. And the sixth one is disproportionality. So that's the last one, and it's meant to determine whether the damage was greater than what any legitimate purpose could justify. So only assuming that the action was somehow justified in the sense that it didn't start in a vacuum, we assess whether the response was truly proportional. For instance, if a random person swears at me in the street and I grab a pistol and shoot them in the head in response, you don't need more than basic common sense to conclude that the act was disproportionate and unjustified. And if all 6 criteria are met, or all 6 answers point towards wrongdoing, then we're no longer dealing with a simple disagreement between people. We're dealing with a full moral violation with real consequences. So I recommend you try to memorize those 6 criteria. They would really give you the moral basis to judge most situations correctly and objectively. Not all of them, but definitely most of them. And this very simple framework can be applied to almost any moral question and solve most of them. Of course, some cases are more complex than the others because some things are harder to prove, especially things like intent, awareness, and environmental circumstances. So test it yourselves, challenge it, find where it works and where it breaks. And in my next video, I will put this framework to the test against multiple moral and legal cases, and we'll see how well it performs. So if you want to explore deeper questions about philosophy, human development, and the search for truth, I welcome you to follow The Absolutian and stick with me for more, and I'll see you in part 2. Thank you.